I took a high-paying job pressing a single button. Huge mistake. Hi everyone. I've decided to share my story here because I don't know where else to turn. The events I will describe have been haunting my life, and I'm at a loss for what to do next. I was desperate and bills were piling up and my savings were almost depleted. As a single parent to a 7-year-old, finding a steady job that pays well and allows me to be home for my child was a challenge. The weight of financial hardship had become a constant companion, whispering doubts and fears into my ear. I spent countless nights staring at the ceiling, worrying about how I would keep a roof over our heads. Then one late night, as I was scrolling through Indeed, a job listing caught my eye. Easy job. Just press a button when the person on camera falls asleep. High pay, immediate start. The pay was astronomical for such a low-effort task. It seemed too good to be true. But at that moment, I was willing to consider anything. After a moment's hesitation, I clicked apply and filled out the application form, hoping for the best but expecting nothing. To my surprise, I received an email within minutes. The company, named Mega Knave Solutions, wanted to schedule an interview the next day. They provided an address and a time. The email was brief and formal, but the speed of their response added to my growing sense of unease. Despite my reservations, I decided to go. The promise of upfront payment was too tempting to pass up. The next morning, I dropped my daughter off at school and headed to the address provided. It was a small, nondescript office building sandwiched between a pawn shop and a vacant lot. The entrance was unremarkable, and the interior was just as bland. The receptionist, a pale woman with a vacant smile, directed me to a small interview room. A man in a suit greeted me, introducing himself as Mr. Gray. His demeanor was calm, almost too calm, which did nothing to ease my nerves. He explained the job. I would be monitoring a live camera feed of a person sleeping. My only task was to press a button the moment the person fell asleep. The job paid $2,000 per night, and I would be paid after each shift. "Why is the pay so high?" I asked, unable to hide my suspicion. "Let's just say we value accuracy and discretion," Mr. Gray replied with a smile that didn't reach his eyes. I started that night. The office where I was to work was in the same building, down a narrow hallway that seemed to stretch longer than it should. The room itself was small, dimly lit, with a single chair facing a large monitor. On the screen was a live feed of a bedroom. The camera was fixed, showing a bed, a nightstand, and a person lying under the covers. The person, a middle-aged man, was already in bed, his eyes closed. Next to the monitor was a single button. I sat down, trying to shake off the creeping unease that had settled over me. The man on the screen remained motionless, and the room around me was silent, save for the faint hum of the monitor. Hours passed, and my nerves began to fray. I found myself leaning closer to the screen, scrutinizing every detail. The man occasionally shifted, but never opened his eyes. Each movement made my heart race, my finger hovering over the button. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, the man's breathing slowed and his body relaxed completely. It was the signal I had been waiting for. With a trembling hand, I pressed the button. Nothing happened. No sound. No indication that my action had been acknowledged. I sat back, exhaling a breath I didn't realize I'd been holding. The clock on the wall showed that my shift was over. I gathered my things, leaving the strange office with a sense of relief. The next day, I received my payment as promised. The money was real, tangible proof that the job, strange as it was legitimate. I tried to put the oddness of the experience out of my mind, but that night, I returned to the office for my second shift. As I settled into the chair, I noticed something peculiar. The man on the screen was in the same position as the night before, wearing the same clothes with the same serene expression on his face. A chill ran down my spine. I brushed it off as a coincidence, convincing myself that it was normal for someone to have similar nightly routines. Hours ticked by and the unsettling feeling grew. The room seemed to close in around me, the silence becoming oppressive. Suddenly, the screen flickered, and for a split second I saw something that made my blood run cold, a shadowy figure standing at the foot of the man's bed. The image was gone as quickly as it appeared, leaving me questioning my sanity. Was it a trick of the light? A glitch in the feed? I didn't know, but my heart pounded in my chest and I couldn't shake the feeling that something was terribly wrong. I pressed the button when the man finally fell asleep, my hand shaking more than before. Over the next few shifts, the oddities continued. I started receiving cryptic messages from my employer, instructions that seemed nonsensical but carried an undertone of urgency. "Do not look away from the screen," one message read. "Keep your focus," said another. The man on the screen remained unchanged, but the shadows around him seemed to move of their own accord. My sleep was plagued by vivid, disturbing dreams. In one, the man on the screen was staring directly at me, his eyes empty and lifeless. In another, I was in his room, unable to move as the shadowy figure loomed closer. I woke up each time drenched in sweat, the details of the dreams etched into my mind. One night, I decided to look into the company, Narration Solutions. There was almost no information available, no website, no reviews, nothing. It was as if the company didn't exist outside of the job listing. My unease grew, but the money was too good to walk away from. I had to endure it, at least until I could find something else. The sense of dread continued to build, and the line between reality and my dreams began to blur. The cryptic messages, the eerie stillness of the man on the screen, and the shadows that seemed to move with a life of their own. All of it was driving me to the edge. Each night I questioned my sanity a little more, wondering if I was caught in some elaborate nightmare. But as the financial burden eased, I couldn't ignore the growing suspicion that I was part of something far more sinister than I had initially believed, and that realization was terrifying. Night after night, I returned to that dimly lit office, each shift dragging me deeper into a state of unease. The man on the screen remained a constant, an unmoving figure whose serene expression belied the growing horror I felt. It wasn't just the repetitiveness that unnerved me. It was the sense that I was being watched, that something or someone was aware of my every move. The cryptic messages from my employer continued, becoming more frequent and more disturbing. "Stay focused," one message read. "Do not turn around," said another. These messages would pop up randomly on my screen, making me jump every time. I couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant to keep me on edge, to keep me scared. One night, as I sat in the small claustrophobic room, the silence was broken by a faint tapping sound. At first, I thought it was just my imagination, a product of my frayed nerves. But as the tapping grew louder and more insistent, I realized it was coming from somewhere inside the office. My heart raced as I scanned the room, but there was nothing out of place. The screen flickered again, and this time, the shadowy figure at the foot of the man's bed lingered longer. It was darker than the shadows around it, its form vaguely humanoid but indistinct. I felt a chill run down my spine as the figure seemed to turn its head, almost as if it were looking directly at me. Then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it vanished. My nights were no longer just about pressing a button when the man fell asleep. They had become a test of endurance, a battle against the creeping paranoia that threatened to overwhelm me. I began to notice other oddities. The room seemed to grow colder as the night wore on, and sometimes I could swear I heard whispering voices, too faint to make out but always present, like a constant murmur in the back of my mind. One night, while I was on my way to the office, I ran into a man who claimed to have worked for Narration Solutions. He was disheveled, his eyes wild and filled with fear. He grabbed my arm and whispered urgently, "Leave while you still can. They're watching us. They're always watching." Before I could ask him any questions, he hurried away, leaving me standing in the street, more confused and terrified than ever. I tried to find out more about Meganabe Solutions, but every attempt led to dead ends. It was as if the company was a ghost, existing only in shadows and whispers. The cryptic messages I received began to include instructions that made no sense. When you see it, stay still, and the shadows know your name. Each message seemed designed to heighten my paranoia, to push me closer to the brink. One evening, Mr. Gray contacted me with a new task. He wanted me to monitor the feed overnight. The pay for this task was double the usual amount, but it came with strict instructions. Do not leave the room. Do not look away from the screen. Press the button as soon as he falls asleep. I arrived at the office earlier than usual, my anxiety already at a fever pitch. The room felt different, more oppressive, as if the very air was thick with foreboding. I sat down and focused on the screen, determined to see the night through. As the hours passed, the strange occurrences intensified. The shadowy figure appeared more frequently, its form becoming clearer each time. It was tall and thin, with long, spindly limbs that seemed to stretch unnaturally. The whispering voices grew louder, filling the room with a chorus of unintelligible murmurs. Around midnight, the power flickered and the room was plunged into darkness. My heart pounded in my chest as I fumbled for my phone to use its light. When the power returned, the screen showed the man on the bed sitting up, his eyes wide open and staring directly at the camera. It was the first time I had seen him move, and it filled me with a deep sense of dread. I pressed the button instinctively, but nothing happened. The man continued to stare, his eyes unblinking and filled with a silent plea. I was paralyzed with fear, unable to look away, unable to do anything but watch. The shadowy figure reappeared, standing behind the man, its long arms reaching out as if to envelop him. The screen flickered again, and the image was replaced with a message. Do not look away. I was trembling, my breath coming in short, panicked gasps. The figure moved closer to the man, its form becoming more defined, more terrifying. It leaned down, and the man's mouth opened in a silent scream. I couldn't take it anymore. I tore my eyes away from the screen, breaking the one rule I had been given. The room around me seemed to come alive, the shadows deepening, and the whispering voices growing louder. I felt something cold and intangible brush against my skin, and I realized that whatever was on the screen was now in the room with me. I couldn't breathe. The cold presence in the room was palpable, wrapping around me like a vice. I clung to the hope that I was imagining it, that this was some elaborate trick my mind was playing on me. But deep down, I knew that whatever was happening was real. The screen flickered again, and the message "Do not look away" was replaced by "Stay still." I forced myself to remain motionless, though every instinct screamed at me to run. The whispering voices seemed to grow louder, more insistent, and the shadows danced around the edges of my vision. I could hear my own breathing, ragged and uneven, mingling with the eerie whispers. I tried to focus on the screen, but my eyes kept drifting to the corners of the room, where the darkness seemed to pulse with a life of its own. The man on the screen had returned to his lying position, his eyes now closed, his body once again at peace. The shadowy figure had vanished, leaving only the oppressive silence behind. I stayed that way for what felt like hours, my body rigid, my mind racing. Eventually, the whispers faded, and the room grew still. I exhaled a shaky breath, my muscles aching from the tension. The clock on the wall showed that my shift was nearly over. With great effort, I forced myself to stand and leave the office. The following day, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. Every shadow seemed to hide something sinister. Every whisper of wind sounded like the hushed voices from the night before. My daughter noticed my unease and asked if I was okay. I forced a smile and assured her that everything was fine, but inside I was falling apart. That night, I returned to the office, dreading what awaited me. The instructions were the same. Monitor the feed. Press the button when the man fell asleep. And most importantly, do not look away. As I sat down and the screen flickered to life. I braced myself for the horrors to come. The man on the screen seemed agitated, his movements more restless than before. The shadowy figure appeared almost immediately, its presence now a familiar source of dread. This time, the figure didn't just stand at the foot of the bed. It moved closer, its spindly arms reaching out towards the man. I pressed the button, hoping to end the nightmare, but the man didn't fall asleep. Instead, he sat up and turned to face the camera, his eyes wide and filled with terror. "Help me," he mouthed, his voice silent but desperate. My heart raced as I watched, unable to tear my eyes away. The shadowy figure loomed over the man, its form growing darker, more menacing. The screen flickered, and a new message appeared. "Do not speak." The figure's arms enveloped the man, and for a moment it seemed to merge with him, its darkness seeping into his very being. The man's face twisted in agony, his silent screams echoing in my mind. I wanted to scream too, but the command on the screen kept me silent. As the figure merged completely with the man, the shadows in the room around me grew thicker, more oppressive. The whispers returned, louder and more coherent. They spoke my name, repeating it over and over, a sinister chant that filled me with dread. Suddenly, the screen went black, and the room was plunged into darkness. I could feel the presence of the shadowy figure, its cold, intangible touch brushing against my skin. I fought the urge to run, to scream, to do anything that might break the spell. The screen flickered back to life, showing the man lying peacefully once more. The message "Do not move" appeared, and I obeyed, too terrified to do otherwise. The figure had vanished, but I could still feel its presence, lurking just beyond the edge of my vision. As the night dragged on, the figure reappeared several times, each time more menacing than the last. It no longer stayed confined to the screen. It seemed to bleed into my reality, the boundaries between the two worlds blurring. My fear reached a fever pitch, every moment a struggle to maintain my sanity. I began to notice changes in my surroundings. Objects in the room seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, subtle but undeniable. The air grew colder, and the whispers became a constant background noise, like a sinister lullaby that never ceased. The final hours of my shift were a waking nightmare. I could feel the figure's presence growing stronger, its influence seeping into every corner of the room. The man on the screen seemed to mirror my own terror, his eyes wide and unblinking, his body tense and rigid. When the clock finally signaled the end of my shift, I fled the office, my mind a whirlwind of fear and confusion. I knew that whatever was happening wasn't confined to the office. It had followed me home, invading my life and my mind. The decision to leave the job was not an easy one, but after that final night, I knew I couldn't continue. The terror I felt wasn't worth any amount of money. I called Mr. Gray the next morning, my voice shaking as I told him I was quitting. He didn't seem surprised or upset. He simply said, "We understand. Your final payment will be transferred today." There was a cold finality to his words that chilled me to the bone. I tried to return to normal life, focusing on my daughter and trying to shake off the lingering sense of dread, but the experience had left a mark, a shadow that clung to my every thought. The house felt different, as if the darkness from the office had followed me home. The first sign that something was wrong came a few nights later. I woke up to find my daughter standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with wide, unblinking eyes. It was the same expression the man on the screen had worn. My heart pounded in my chest as I gently called her name. She blinked, then turned and walked back to her room without a word. The next day, she began to draw strange pictures. They were crude but unsettling. Screens with buttons, shadowy figures, and messages like "Don't move" and "Don't speak," scrawled in her childish handwriting. I asked her where she had seen these things, but she just shrugged and said she didn't know. The drawings became more frequent, each one more disturbing than the last. She started sleeping in the same position as the man from the screen, her body rigid and her eyes closed in a semblance of peace that was anything but restful. Some nights, I would find her staring at me from her bed, her eyes wide and filled with an unnatural awareness. My nights were filled with sleepless terror as I watched over my daughter, my mind replaying the horrors I had witnessed in that office. The whispers I had heard there seemed to follow me home, now faint but ever present, like a sinister background noise that I couldn't escape. I took her to see a doctor, but they found nothing wrong. They attributed her behavior to stress or an overactive imagination. I wanted to believe them, but deep down I knew the truth. Whatever darkness I had encountered in that job had latched onto my daughter, using her innocence as a conduit for its malevolence. I tried to burn the drawings, but more appeared almost as if she were compelled to create them. Each new picture drove another nail into the coffin of my sanity, the images haunting my every waking moment. I felt like a prisoner in my own home, trapped by an unseen force that I couldn't fight. One night, as I was tucking her in, she looked at me with those same wide, unblinking eyes and said, "They're watching us, Mommy. They're always watching." The words sent a chill down my spine, the same phrase the man in the street had told me. I barely slept that night, my mind racing with fear and helplessness. When I finally drifted off, I dreamt of the man on the screen, his face twisted in agony as the shadowy figure enveloped him. I woke up drenched in sweat, the whispers louder than ever. In the weeks that followed, the situation only worsened. My daughter began to speak in her sleep, repeating the commands I'd seen on the screen. "Do not move. Do not speak." She would sit up in bed and stare at the wall, her eyes vacant and distant. I could see the shadow of the figure in her drawings growing darker and more defined with each passing day. One morning, I found a new drawing taped to her bedroom wall. It was a perfect depiction of the room I had worked in down to the smallest detail. In the center of the drawing was a figure hunched over a monitor, with a dark shadow looming behind it. Below it were the words, "Don't look away." I knew then that the nightmare was far from over. The darkness that had seeped into my life wasn't something I could escape or ignore. It had taken root, and its influence was growing stronger, feeding off my fear and my daughter's innocence. As I watched her sleep, lying in that same eerie position, I felt a shiver of dread. Her eyes fluttered open, and she looked at me with that haunting stare. "Mommy," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "They're here." The realization hit me with the force of a tidal wave. The shadowy figure, the whispers, the commands, they weren't confined to the office. They were here, in my home, in my daughter's mind, and they weren't going to leave. I'm reaching out to this community in hopes that someone might have experienced something similar or can offer advice. Has anyone encountered a company called Mega Knave Solutions or dealt with anything remotely like this? The shadowy figure, the whispers, the commands, they're destroying our lives, and I'm terrified for my daughter's safety. Please, if you have any information or can point me in the direction of someone who might be able to help, let me know. I'm desperate to protect my daughter and reclaim our lives from this living nightmare. I will try to keep you posted on any developments. Thank you for reading and for your support. Thank you for listening and delving into the dark with me. I would be so grateful if you please click the thumbs up, subscribe, and leave a comment. The more engagement this video gets, the more YouTube will push my content to others, and thus our twisted little community will grow. All stories read on this channel will be available on Spotify, iTunes, iHeartRadio, and many other podcast apps. Links are in the description. Thank you again for listening, and I look forward to hearing from you.